I'm Peter Susskind, Director of the U.S.-Russia-China Trialogue Project at the Stimson Center. Since the middle of the 20th century, relations among the United States, Russia, and China have had an enormous impact on each country separately and on the world as a whole. The purpose of the Trialogue is to better understand this extraordinarily complex and consequential relationship by directly engaging with experts from all three countries. In this show, guests from across the political spectrum and from every corner of the globe share their views in their own voice. While the Stimson Center seeks to provide access to a wide variety of perspectives, it does not endorse any particular position. We leave it to the listeners to judge the validity and value of the views expressed by the guests. I hope you enjoy the podcast. My guest today is Victoria Panova, Vice Rector of HSC, perhaps Russia's top university. Victoria is head of Russia's BRICS Expert Council and Sherpa of Russia in the G20. In this episode, we discuss the history of BRICS, Russia's attitude toward the association, and the differences between BRICS and other international formats, such as the G7 and the G20. Victoria, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hello, good to see you.
I happen to be in a forest in Latvia by the Baltic Sea, and you, I imagine, are in Moscow at the moment?
Yes, at the moment back already home, but in between the business trips.
And you were just in Brazil for the recent BRICS summit.
Yeah, it was a very interesting trip and very interesting event, as usual, to see how it works.
Well, we're going to ask you to tell us all about that particular summit, but I thought we would begin by discussing the long history of BRICS, its many transformations, and your association with it. So at what point did you personally begin focusing on BRICS?
Well, I can tell you even a bit beyond that, because I could be comparing how not only BRICS works, but how all the club mechanisms work. And club mechanisms was like G7, G20, and BRICS. So since I was a student, when I started making my PhD, I got much more involved into scholarly research of the G8. You remember there was once a G8.
In which Russia was briefly a member.
Yeah.
And, how long was Russia part of the G8? How long was the G7 the G8?
It's also a tricky question, because when the Soviet Union was falling apart, Gorbachev was at the end of the very 80s and early 90s, 91. He was trying to establish contacts with the G7 and trying to establish partner relations. And at the very beginning, neither Gorbachev nor Yeltsin, when the Soviet Union already fell apart, were really taken seriously. Yes, they were invited to sit there. I remember that the first letter that came from Gorbachev to greet the leaders of the G7, it was kind of discouraged if you look at their memoirs of their, like British, for example. But later on, Yeltsin or his prime ministers were invited.
This was when?
It was Denver 97. It was first time then like Russia was invited for the full scale of almost everywhere. But it was more internal American politics, which ensured that this was where Russia needed to be part of it. 98, Birmingham, it was more of an established situation in UK. But nevertheless, we still had some meetings where Russia was not allowed. But if we look, like I personally think that the full membership, because we saw this participation since the early 90s, right? But the full membership could be traced to Kananaskis 2002, when it was first time in the history of the G7, G8, that all the countries were listed who would be presiding in which year. Because usually it was like an oral gentleman decision. Mm-hmm. And there was a sequence. It was never broken, right? We saw first France, then US, etc. And Canada and Italy joined a bit later. So in 2002, it was first time when in the documents, we had the written evidence on who presides after who. And Russia, in fact, as a new member, was not invited as it usually comes to the end, as it happened like with Italy and Canada.
You mean new members are usually put at the end of the line in terms of the sequence?
Least with Italy and Canada, it happened like this. But this time, it was a golden age at the point of Russia-West cooperation. And it was put in the list that it will preside in 2006. So Germany offered its place. So that's why they were hosting the summit in 2007. So it was put in the middle. Well, with regards to Golden Age, I can say Russia lived through this very turbulent period of the 90s. I'm talking about internal things, but also on the
The
international
collapse of the
arena.
economy, difficult political situation.
Yeah, default in 98 after their Asian crisis of 97. And there was a danger, and many economists, in fact, feared that there will be another default in 2002, 2003, when it was supposed that Russia would not be able to pay properly for its debt to IMF. But energy conjunction in the world, it worked differently. So this didn't happen. Russia,
because the energy prices went
this
up.
was one of the reasons. And we saw that Russia didn't go through this another default period and started going out gradually with the, proper political economic decisions. And thus it managed to talk to the other leaders, not as somebody who begs for something, as was especially the first Yeltsin-Kozyrev period, but somebody who could be helping, in fact, talking equally. You remember, many people forget about it, but with their Iraqi rift between US and some of the NATO members, in fact, Russia was the one, and Putin invited everybody in 2003 to St. Petersburg for 300th anniversary of their city. And it was the first time when Bush met with the German, with the French, and they kind of shook hands. It was even before the summit. So it was interesting.
So when the Americans and the French were fighting about the approach to Iraq in 2002, 2003, Putin was the one who was personally mending transatlantic relations.
Absolutely. That's what he did. So those were interesting times. We managed not to get into the other economic and financial hole. We got out. Our GDP was growing faster than other economies. We were in the same boat with who are now BRICS, China, India, with having higher growth rates.
So the logic in Russia, originally with Gorbachev under Perestroika, is that Soviet Union is one of the two great powers and there should be a convergence. Convergence resulted in collapse. After living through the turbulent 90s, Russia seeks and gains membership in the club of the dominant developed powers. And the G7, which becomes the G8, represents this in some respects. So in the early 2000s, Putin is at the G8. He's mediating between the French and the Americans who are fighting about the Middle East. And BRICS is a different paradigm that we get to later, which sort of places the global South, the developing emerging economies, almost as an alternative to this established Western developed G7 or G8, right? But so at what point does BRICS emerge? Is it true that it was a Goldman Sachs economist who first coined the term?
Well, no, Goldman Sachs he coined the term, but he meant marketing. So he had to make a product.
This was when?
2001, right? So he had to sell something to their big Western investors. So they had to see where their money could be going in order to get the biggest profits. And obviously, as I said, Russia at those times were in the camp of the emerging developing economies that were rising the most.
So this Goldman Sachs economist was looking to advise clients about where best to invest in the international market,
Absolutely.
But also searching for an acronym that would roll off the tongue. So of the emerging markets, Brazil, India, China, and Russia were selected because it sounded good and it looked good on paper as an economic opportunity. But at that point, Russia was in a dual role because on one hand, it had been invited as a former and perhaps future great power to the club of G7, which then became G8. On the other hand, it was an emerging market alongside states that had not been considered great powers like Brazil.
Well, absolutely. But there was the understanding there has to be more of cooperation with their developing emerging economies. And Russian elites, it was expressed mostly by Yevgeny Primakov, who was first foreign minister and then prime minister. And it was like 96, 98 when he started pushing for the idea of BRIC, the triangle between Russia, India, China, while Kozyrev and Yeltsin were totally forgetting about the rest of the world and concentrating just on the West and thinking, oh, we have to get into the Western family. Many people did not agree with that. They didn't see the potential in putting all eggs in just one basket, right? And Primakov, one of the most prominent people who expressed that and was pushing it forward. And that is why he came up with this idea of triangle, Russia, India, China. There was this tour of Latin American countries and Brazil being an important and strategic partner. It didn't work at that moment, but not because of their economic problems in Russia. But there were some tensions that we still have in the bilateral relations between India and China. But they now kind of overcoming it to work for some bigger purpose.
But so in the late 90s, early 2000s, basically from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin, there was a desire to integrate into the Western developed world, and membership in the G7 was acknowledgement of that status. On the other hand, there were those like Primakov who were looking at non-Western emerging markets and seeking to create ties with them. And so he came up with something that was a lot like what BRICS would be. So you have the Goldman Sachs guy coining BRIC, and you have Primakov creating RIC, or seeking to, in the late 90s.
Yeah.
But so at what point does BRIC become a coherent international club? When do those countries take this acronym and make it their own?
Well, first of all, Putin was more in their understanding of Primakov in this regard. Yes, he very much thought it is important to continue integration with the Western countries. And I remember it was very interesting when first time he came after Yeltsin was present in the summits. And in fact, many journalists adored him, many participants as well, the leaders. He was friend of the G7 leaders. And Putin came, and Russia, for the first time, he said, it's not in Russian, it sounds "кляндчить неприлично." It's not nice to beg. So he was very much seen as a young, strong leader who finally brought country not to ask for something like for restructure of the debt. He said, we can do it. We are participants, full scale, and we're ready to contribute. But at the same time, we are witnessing another situation. In 1999, it is the G7 that is coming up with the idea of the G20. The countries of the West, they thought, okay, we have to involve more of the developing countries in order to solve some of the issues that we cannot solve on our own. But what is important that along with the G20, G8 started having on a leaders level this outreach format. In 2005, during UK presidency, they decided to invite the biggest economies, the most important systemic ones from emerging world, China, India, South Africa, Brazil. And around this time, it was also Russia realizing more and more that our interests lay not just with the West, we're much bigger than that. Some interests fall in together with the developing world, some with the developed world, and thus there has to be more cooperative approach in this regard. And during our presidency in 2006...
Presidency at G8.
In the G8, yes. Russia invited as outreach same countries as was in 2005. And I can tell you that I heard some critique from our Western partners saying, oh, why did you do that? They will think they are important, then we'll have to talk to them on a permanent basis. And so we said, okay, it's your opinion, but we as a chairing country, we have the right to invite who we think is proper. So we did that. And I can tell you it was a very different process because from what I remember, we've been in close consultations already with all the outreach 5 countries.
Which countries are those? India, China, who else?
China, Brazil, South Africa, I believe Egypt was their fifth one. And so they were informed of what's been happening, and we had consultations with them on a regular basis throughout the year. Next year, it was Germany who was presiding. Despite previous critique, they said, okay, we already have those countries. We should launch a high-level process of permanent consultations. So it's kind of institutionalized. And over that time, Russia was also kind of talking more and more to those countries and seeing more projects of their own. So we had high-level Aquila. Aquila is 2009 Italy. It was like a full name of this outreach, but with the institutionalization leaders level of the G20, this kind of died out. But at the same time, we saw the birth of BRICS, because in 2006, during the Russia's presidency, we already had a separate meetings on the sidelines of their United Nations General Assembly, foreign ministers of India, China, Russia, and Minister of Defense of Brazil, talking together and discussing issues of the common importance for them. And at the same time, the underlying process of dialogue between those countries, following Primakov idea, following convergence with interests coming from China, from Brazil, from India, realizing themselves more and more as global powers. That's brought a good moment for the BRICS to start.
But so when was the first BRIC meeting held? When and where?
It was 2009 in Yekaterinburg.
So in Russia.
Yeah, but interestingly, the very first meeting was held in the December of 2008. Well, 2006 was on their sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. We had also some representatives of those countries coming, so St. Petersburg Economic Forum. But December 2008, we had an academic forum. So all scholars from these countries came to Moscow, and it preceded, in a way, the summit in Yekaterinburg 2009. So I wasn't there at the point, but our big wise men from the four countries, they were deliberating on what they could be doing on an international arena in order to put forward their cooperation. And
so there was an unofficial meeting in Moscow in 2008 with experts from India, China, and Brazil to discuss possibilities of quadrilateral cooperation. And then a number of months later, there was the first official BRIC meeting in Yekaterinburg, Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know what? This academic forum, together with the business forum, they were recognized in 2013 in Durban as official outreach format. So we have it every year since 2008, and since 2013, it is recognized. And I can tell you, such big initiatives like New Development Bank and Network University, they came from BTTC and Academic Forum.
But so both the expert meeting and the first official meeting were held in Russia. Was that an accident? Could it have happened in Delhi, or was the Russian leadership particularly eager to put this format together?
Well, I can tell you that Russia was serious about pushing forward the format. So I don't think it was a coincidence. And the other countries were ready to look at how it works, to see if it corresponds to their interest as much as, for example, like previous more informal consultations or bilateral formats. And I guess Yekaterinburg did work out fine, as we had next year in 2010 further invitation of South Africa.
So South Africa was added at the third meeting officially, was proposed at the second meeting, and South Africa provides the S at the end of the BRICS acronym.
Yeah, already the big S.
So it used to be a little S, and now it's BRICS with a big S, all capital letters. Why was South Africa chosen by the original four?
Well, in fact, a lot of it came from China, and it's a known fact that China was very much promoting for that. But it corresponded with all the countries' idea that Africa is absolutely absent at the moment from the global decision making. So we need to have it at the table in order to ensure universality and comprehensiveness of our decisions. And I know that at some points there were discussions, not in BRICS, but in the scholar debates, who could be representing itself as a leader of Africa. So many say, okay, there's no single leader, so there could be three countries that are represented in a whole of Africa, like South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria. But at that point, for a number of factors and also the desire of South Africa to fight for its interests on the international arena, also its objective economic parameters proved that probably it was like the best first step in order to get into African continent and to start ensuring that its voice is heard in BRICS and wider.
So the first four members had a clear understanding that they wanted Africa to be represented, settled on South Africa, and South Africa itself expressed interest. But you mentioned that China had a particular interest in adding South Africa. Why did China want to do this?
Well, it was important for China to, with itself growing its economy and spreading into different markets, bringing about this idea of Belt and Road. Of course, it has to encompass different emerging economies of the world. So, but as I said, yes, China was very much proposing it, but it was not just the desire of China, because it did correspond with the rest of the group. Similarly, many say current expansion was pushed by China, and there were different ideas within both Brazil and India of how this should be done, whether they should proceed at all. And there were lots of publications, if you remember, that they were kind of against it, but leaders came and they
So
decided.
we'll get to recent rounds of expansion in a moment. But so you said that when Primakov in the 90s had an idea of creating a China-India-Russia triangle, the tension disputes between India and China made that impossible at the time. Why was that not an issue with the original BRIC and then BRICS? What was the relationship between India and China like in those early meetings?
Well, because by that time, when you look at more global problems that cannot be achieved by the countries on their own, they understand they have to pool resources in order to get what is vital for their own development, for their, of course, they will put things that are less important behind. They would not forget about them. And we saw several times that those relations were sparking again, but it didn't break the group. And it even provided for some extra platform for them to talk. But also it provided for a stimulus to be agreeing on the terms of those conflicts in order not to forget and not to, let's say, fail the big ideas that needed to be discussed at the summits. And that's same to what we have with the current incoming members. It's not rosy relations between them either. We have some bilaterals in between as well. But you saw with the first two summits that they were part of, this didn't come up as their problem on the agenda. So yes, it's still not resolved. So BRICS is not a miracle. It's not a magic wand in order to ensure that countries solve their bilateral issues very fast. No, it doesn't work like that. This will continue to be on the agenda. They had some breakthrough in heading last year at Kazan summit. They agreed on some necessity to move forward on the bilaterals.
India and China did.
Yeah. So let's see how it goes. At least so far, I'm seeing kind of a positive path, and I didn't see nothing sparking, hopefully, between them. We saw other conflicts, like for me, unexpected, rather, like Thailand, Cambodia, for example. But the BRICS members seem to be valuing their membership too much and meaning to try to overcome their bilateral issues.
So can you go through the history of BRICS since its founding and divide it into stages, if that makes sense, or moments when the agenda may have shifted in a new direction or the self-conception of the format changed?
Initially, it was more about economics and finance. And if you look at the first summits, many of it was about the reform of their international Bretton Woods institutions. So primarily, it was more about pushing economic and financial interests of their emerging economies. But what we see now, it's a comprehensive mechanism because we have three pillars: politics and security, finance and economy, people to people and culture, that are taking more or less equal place in their dialogue. And if you look nowadays, politics or governance is occupying a huge place. Look at the last declaration, right? Very strong. If at the beginning they were trying to be more mild and asking very generally to reform United Nations, to bring peace to all conflicts. Now, if you look at political section, governance section, they are pointing out specific problems that are yet not solved and not looked at by the West, and in fact are blocked from the West, like geographic representation and membership for Secretariat. And as we know, Secretariat now doesn't play just technical role, which it should play. As
You're talking about the UN secretary?
Yeah, we're talking more and very precisely about necessity to have more geographic diversification, because I don't remember figures now right now, but absolute majority of those who are employed for Secretariat, they are from the West. There's no...
The absolute majority of those that are full-time staff in the UN Secretariat are Western.
Yeah. So this is one of the issues that has been raised for some time already, but now it's very clearly put into the final document. That's one thing. Another thing, they're very concrete about conflicts. As I said, from the very beginning, where they were more mild and kind of general, they in fact put out their positions. On some points, they're like national positions where they recognize it, but they were very strong on Gaza, very strong on Iran. There's very strong position of BRICS on unilateral sanctions, on the very strong position on terrorist attacks that are launched by states or terrorist groups. I think that's a new stage from this point of view. So yes, gradual from mostly economic and financial to comprehensive, but now even not afraid of putting what it really thinks onto the paper and then into the real world. That's a change. I think it's recognized itself as an important factor, and they're ready to take responsibility, not just in pushing some of their own projects in the absence of movement from the West, like on IMF or on World Bank, but they're ready to be more assertive in fighting for an equitable world, not against the West. Once again, it's important to say because, yes, many see it as a threat. Trump sees it as a threat. But you saw, in fact, when you start threatening a group like that, it brings you to the absolutely opposite situation. Many experts were saying that BRICS will dissolve. Every year I hear the same, it wouldn't survive. For more than 15 years, I hear that BRICS will dissolve very soon. I know in a number of attempts to have bilateral carrots and sticks for each of the BRICS members and incoming BRICS members in order for them to like BRICS less. But the idea behind it that, yeah, we don't want to be enemies, but we do mind our own development. And for this development, we cannot have limitations imposed by their other richer, bigger, stronger countries. We want our own way. If we can do it together, that's the best. And we are very precise of how this could be done together. This is an important point from their point of view of evolution of BRICS.
So what does BRICS stand for now? So in Brazil, there was, I think in the recent summit in Brazil, there was an emphasis on the status of the global South.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I mean, China thinks of itself as part of the global South, despite being the biggest economy in the world. Russia, geographically at least, is in a very different position. What is the BRICS agenda, the BRICS self-conception, the BRICS mission now?
Well, Global South remains an important notion, and I can tell you we do have continuous debates on how to term this, because like in Russia, you mentioned our geographic position. Yes, we could be part of the emerging EMDCs, right? But
What is an AMDC?
emerging markets in developing countries. But we're the most northern, one of the most northern countries in the world. It's like 1/3 of it lies in their permafrost. And that's why we're suggesting the terminology of world majority or global majority.
As opposed to global south.
Yes, in order to be more inclusive, but we're still working on that. So some kind of compromises, we say sometimes not global south, but global south in east, because China is not as much also the south, but so we are working. And in fact, when we either say global south or global south and east or global majority, we understand each other.
So what do you mean?
In BRICS, between us.
But so what is there in common between world majority, global south, and global south and east? All these concepts share what characteristic?
They share the characteristic that it involves BRICS plus countries, not just those who are members of the BRICS, but countries that were deprived of possibility to develop in a just and appropriate manner, and whose interests have to be ensured on the global arena. And that is why, if you look at the declarations, BRICS do not only look into themselves, right, and their own development, but they're talking about the possibility of having those changes, institutional and structural, in their global international model that will reflect interests of those countries, not just BRICS, as I said, but all African countries, all Asian countries, as much as it's possible, of course, big and small. At least that's the idea that lies behind it.
How did the war in Ukraine in 2022 change the organization and the sanctions that were then levied against Russia?
Well, first of all, it's not an organization, right? Like the G7 or the G20. I hate when people call it organization. It's a club. It's a association.
So how did the association change after the Russia-Ukraine war entered a new stage and Western sanctions were levied against Russia?
Well, if you look at last year in Kazan, Russia didn't seem like a country which was isolated or was alone on their international arena. We had objective reasons why Lula da Silva didn't come. And
the president of Brazil.
President of Brazil, yes. And
those objective reasons are that he slipped and fell and bumped his head?
No, that's real, unfortunately.
I know it doesn't sound real the way I said it, but it is real, right?
Yeah,
so it was an injury
real.
that prevented him from coming.
Yes, and the rest, we had 36 global leaders that came, including international organization heads. So it was a big gathering. From this point of view, I would say it didn't change much from the position of Russia, because starting from 2022, of course, countries are cautious. They don't want to be very much under fire of illegal sanctions that Russia has imposed. We have, I believe, 23.5 thousand, biggest amount sanctions levied on us. And of course, there has to be some changes in logistics and trade routes and in how it all works. But if you see, none of the BRICS countries said, oh, yeah, we will join the sanction. We wouldn't trade with Russia, we wouldn't work with it. They all continue to trade with us. In fact, if you look, some of the BRICS countries have even much bigger trade turnover with Russia. In fact, using the opportunity.
Since 2022.
Yes, that is brought by Western limitations and its attempt to put Russia down. So from the point of view of decisions that are taken, I would say, in fact, 2022 played against the West. In which way? In BRICS. I'll give you a historic parallel. You remember when OPEC used embargo, and it was taken very seriously, and we had International Energy Agency created, and then policies started to be coherent, and more emphasis was made on technological advancement in this area. And this is how the West managed to make a leap when it encountered trouble of limitations on how much energy it could be getting. It didn't really result in physical deficit, but that was a wake-up call, and it helped them in terms of economic and technological development a lot. Here, in a way, similarly, when Russia was kind of deprived of SWIFT, had sanctions when dollar and SWIFT was used as a weapon against it. Yeah, many BRICS countries, they continue using dollar and continue trading in SWIFT. But it's a huge wake-up call because everybody understands that this could be used anytime against them. And all those countries are together because they want to be independent. And in fact, what did change a lot, that they started much more intense negotiations of bringing about a new payment system, not instead, parallelly, because those who are friends with US and West, they want to benefit from current trade relations, and they will. But of course, they're interested in having some parallel system that will be ensuring their independence and their ability to for unhampered trade and for sovereign trade between themselves. So, in fact, this Ukraine crisis pushed some of the issues that were on top of the agenda at their very first years of BRICS deliberations, because de-dollarization, in fact, was quite, well, at least loud the first couple of years. Then it tuned down and they shifted to other issues that were more relevant. Although they did have, 11 years ago, they did strike the framework agreement on trade in national currencies. There is such thing. And we had CRA.
But it didn't go. So that was a theme early on, de-dollarization, national currencies, but it didn't go anywhere.
Very briefly, de-dollarization was on for some time, use of national currencies. In fact, China was very persistent. So they developed it much, not just within BRICS. So they were very consistent in putting more of national currency use in their trade with other countries, not just BRICS countries. So framework agreements is one thing. Yes, they put in CRA, contingent reserve arrangements, and new development bank. But this was, first of all, responding to a stalemate in negotiations on IMF, on World Bank leadership, etc. But it was more local in a way, if I can put it this way. But this crisis, that it gave urgency to those issues once again, and that's why they started discussing the ideas of how they could remain independent in the situation, well, once global public goods, public services that were said that they are public and they cannot be deprived from everybody, right? Once this word was broken and started being used as a weapon. So, in fact, it gave opposite results. And threats do bring opposite results.
But so what are the results? I understand that now it is a very important item on the agenda. De-dollarization, the creation of alternative payment systems not controlled by Washington and the West. But how much progress has been made toward realizing these objectives? The dollar seems as strong as ever, and it's not clear if there's a real workable alternative to SWIFT, or has some progress been made in these areas?
Well, it's a much longer process than, those people who are not financiers, they would think it could be easy. I can tell you that the use of NDB, in my mind, was very fast because similar issues within the G7 took about 10 years to realize.
NDB is the development bank of BRICS.
New development bank, yes. It got realized just within 2.5 years after it was raised first time and discussed in our academic forum. So from the BTTC, BRICS Think Tank Council, to when it was opened and already launched, 2.5 years. So it's fast. And in here, we do have a number of, I believe, quite workable options, but the technical details need to continue to be run because there are different legal systems.
And we're talking about alternative payment systems now. So there is progress being made, but this is still a difficult technical issue to resolve.
And of course, nobody would be talking about particularities of that before it's all launched.
Well, then a question connected to this, if you can share it. The U.S. recently passed legislation concerning stable coins, cryptocurrency, digital currency tied to American dollars. Is there any work in BRICS being done in this direction? Is there consideration of the possible utility of digital currencies? Because in the case of this particular American legislation, the idea was to preserve dollar hegemony using these tools.
Of course, because this is one of the options for, like, in terms of possible use of new technologies. And I think it would be much more coherent for all sides if new standards and new rules and regulations for the new areas, be it digital currency, be it artificial intelligence, be it other issues, advanced issues, it would benefit much more if we come on a joint standards. BRICS are working on those, of course, but probably it's time for the United States to think that if it wants to impose just its own thinking and its own regulation on the others, even having EU doesn't seem to be as an independent actor. So I don't think it would work well. So as BRICS is working on those areas quite strongly recently, maybe it makes sense to stop seeing it as a threat and stop threatening everybody that if you work with BRICS, you're enemy of ours, right? It makes sense to see how US can benefit from having more relations and offering, you came about in the 70s with the G7. You have to realize now it's not a trilateral world of US, Europe, Japan. It is much more diverse. And just disregarding other strong powers who have different ideas would not lead to a win-win situation. It would lead to lose-lose situation. Same for United States. So it's a much longer answer than you probably expected. But yes, we do consider that. And I believe it would make sense to have some goodwill on the part of the United States to be joining forces together in order to look into such systems, which would not...
How would that work? Right now, BRICS is seeking to develop alternative payment systems, use national currencies, perhaps digital currencies backed by national currencies, in order to avoid existing sanctions, possible future sanctions, and generally control from Washington. But if the war in Ukraine ends and Russia-US relations improve, if Trump and Xi strike some grand bargain around Taiwan or a good trade deal, is there a sort of BRICS vision for an overarching economic system that would be devised together with the West and not as an alternative to it, or together with the US?
So far, that's what we're discussing within a number of formats, both track 2 and official track. But now we're coming out of the current realities. And we do need probably United States to come out and say, yes, we're ready to work together. Because now we would be only thinking for you guys what could be good for you. And that's how you usually approach others. You think, okay, this is good for us, this is good for you, let's do it this way. BRICS countries do not work this way. It's a very foreign concept. We're very different. We try to understand each other. It's sometimes very difficult. But some issues or things that seem to be very obvious to one country say, okay, this is good for everybody. No, it doesn't work like that. So we're discussing some models of cooperation and systems where we understand how it would work for other countries with whom we have dialogue and outreach. We might think of how could US be involved, and we're ready for this constructive dialogue. But I guess we need you guys to be part of it in order to have it, but not as a mentor, as one of us. It's my personal opinion. I'm just an expert, not an official. But from what we do discuss, what are the principles and what are the main guiding lines for the international system that would be working for all? But it's precise, concrete, bricks, of the edifice. They need to be put together by all sides. We can be building something for us, thinking that it could be good for you, but it might be not good for you. So if you guys want to be part of the process, you need to rethink your own approach to us, to BRICS. You need to rethink your own approach to each other country as a subordinate. It is not. And start thinking not of lose-lose, but win-win. That's
but
important.
If Trump were to propose U.S. membership in BRICS, BRICS would not accept it at the moment.
Not in current situation, of course, because you do have sanctions against, like one of the criteria, you have to have respectful relations and no sanctions with all the BRICS countries. U.S. will have to first learn how to be able to talk to others as equals.
But not even
No
just talk.
mentorship.
So in terms of formal BRICS rules, the U.S. would have to eliminate all sanctions against Iran and Russia before it could technically
And
join
China.
BRICS. And China. Well, I don't know if we have sanctions against China. I guess for maybe the Uyghur stuff.
Well, technological
tariffs.
limitations you do.
Export controls.
Yeah.
Count. So finally, then, what is the logic of BRICS expansion? There was a major round of expansion recently. Egypt, Ethiopia, UAE, Iran, Indonesia, right?
Yes. And we have Saudi Arabia who was invited, said they would join, but then they have a kind of status where they come for some meetings. And I remember last year, Presidential aide Ushakov said, oh no, they decided they wouldn't join. And immediately Saudis came, no, we didn't say that. We will be part of, but we're still thinking. So they are participating.
And then there are any number of partner countries.
And 10 partner countries, because we had Vietnam joining, kind of claiming that recently. So now it used to be 9, now it's 10.
So what's the logic of the expansion? How much of this is driven by, you said that in the Kazan meeting, it didn't look like Russia was isolated because there were so many world leaders in the country. Was this a major driver for expansion? Russia's desire to show that it wasn't isolated? How are new members selected? They're all very different in size and economy and geography.
Well, you're talking about tactics. Like, this is just one thing. And having invited countries for membership, it's not just for once or twice. So you cannot say that, oh, we wanted to demonstrate. No, it's just something that came about, let's say, incidentally. We were having regular work and we had so many countries interested in coming in order to decide on issues of common interest. But their expansion itself, the decision on it happened 1 year earlier in 2023 in Johannesburg in South Africa. In fact, we invited preliminarily, it was 6 countries. Argentina did agree, but then Milei came and said, no, we don't want to be part of it. But he's an interesting character. So
Javier Milei, when he won the election unexpectedly, he withdrew Argentina from consideration of BRICS membership immediately.
Yes. If you look at the G7 and BRICS, we have some things that are very opposite. First of all, you guys are more hierarchical. So United States does lead the dialogue. In BRICS, we're very horizontal. China is the biggest, but it doesn't lead the dialogue. When it is presiding, it leads the dialogue, but that's it. It doesn't have anything that it directs others. China cannot dictate India. It cannot dictate Russia. And it doesn't, because they realize they wouldn't do it. That's first difference. Second difference is that we don't cross each other's red lines. We understand there are national specificities and some things that other country cannot allow itself to do. So we don't try to nag this country, say, oh, you're bad, and you have to either go ahead with the rest or not. And the big third one is G7 always possessed itself as exclusive club. So yes, you invited Russia first as outreach to kind of avoid some revisionist policies, whatever, right? So there were different reasons behind that. But you didn't really, the rest you looked out to outreach as kind of some subordinate countries to you. So G7 positions itself as exclusive. And it's been for, oh, by the way, 50 years already. I know G7 once invited China, but also on a similar account as they were inviting Russia with, okay, you will go through stages. And China said, no, I don't want to be part of that. G7 wants to keep it a closed club. BRICS always said it is inclusive club. So while, of course, there has to be a reason behind how many countries could be joining and what procedure they could be joined, how the partner process would work, because it's efficiency as well. But at the same time, we cannot neglect that if countries want to join you, you have to be responsive. You cannot be saying, no, it's closed, full stop. We have more than 30 countries that kind of in line for that, right? And there had to be a next step. It's a very difficult one because, of course, once you enlarge, takes much more efforts to agree on things than a group of 5 and group of 10. So yes, we understand efficiency cannot be compromised because we did reach a number of interesting ideas and then projects that have to be not just kept, they have to develop further, they have to bring more benefits to it, and they have to serve for the purpose of why they were created. And that is why we have to be cautious about how we manage those two waves of expansion. So I would say there has to be a pause now. It doesn't start being exclusive nowadays in the number of 10. But we have to realize how the newcomers are integrated into everything that we have, because it's a huge amount of projects. And some of them are not as loud as NDB, for example, but each of them, like NTI architecture, 13 groups, working groups on each of cutting edge technology issue, scientific projects. They have to get into those. And I can name many other. So after this is solved, then we'll continue seeing whether BRICS needs further expansion, or it could be working on their proposition of the new international model or reformed international relations in its current form together with its partner countries. So it all has to be seen. But the idea is that it's inclusive, so we cannot let others down, but we have to ensure efficiency. That's why we'll have a pause and see how the integration process comes and what each country could be getting and contributing to the BRICS with its inclusion.
Okay. Well, thank you for giving us a tour of BRICS, of one of the hottest clubs, it seems, on the scene right now, if we just look at the line at the door for those who want to get in. So thanks again for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the Trialogue Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. The Trialogue Podcast is hosted by the Stimson Center and produced by University FM.